My name is Philip Jenkins. I'm with the Institute for Studies of Religion, ISR, and with my colleague here, Tony Kidd. We have the pleasure of directing what's called historical studies in religion. The great thing about that is we can bring in all these great speakers we're interested in and have a series of programs. This fits into a couple of our purposes. If you've been attending these lectures over the last few years, you know that we've done several events on the subject of the ancient Eastern churches, the Syriac churches, and this one fits very nicely into that scheme. Just on something of a sort of a more general note, I'm always struck by the fact that you have so many great universities and great scholars not too far from here within Texas. And it's almost as if we're on like different continents for the ease with which we often get them in. So it's such a great pleasure to do this. Our speaker today is a scholar I admire a great deal, Brent Landau. He currently teaches in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Texas. He received his ThD and MDiv from Harvard University, his original degrees from Iowa. His chief research is on ancient Christian apocryphal writings, and his best-known book is called The Revelation of the Magi, The Lost Tale of the Wise Men's Journey to Bethlehem, published by HarperCollins in 2010. More recently, he co-edited this impressive book, ideal for self-defense, which is called New Testament Apocrypha, More Non-Canonical Scriptures, which he edited together with Tony Burke, the first in a series of volumes which, among other things, just give a sense of the scale and the importance of just how much there is out there and just what the historical resources are. He's also involved in a group which does some great resources, the North American Society for the Study of Christian Apocryphal Literature, and I get emails from this reasonably regularly, or as I describe them, my communications from, I can't not call it NASCAR. Okay. It's NASCAR.
I lobbied for that, but
NASCAR.
We wouldn't have gotten the domain name. That's the problem.
That's probably true.
Yeah.
Whatever. Anyway, NASCAR scholar. No. And Brent is, as you see, is going to be talking about Christmas from the wise men's point of view. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Philip, for that kind introduction and the invitation to travel a couple hours north to Baylor. Certainly I-35 is always a pleasant trip. But I'm very happy to be here. Always happy to be here in one piece. But I want to talk a little bit about how I got interested in the study of the wise men. So I had this book come out in 2010, The Revelation of the Magi, The Lost Tale of the Wise Men's Journey to Bethlehem, published by HarperCollins. Essentially, it's a distillation of my dissertation research. So it's a translation of the text that I'll be talking about today with a introduction and conclusion that is designed for kind of a more general audience. Scholars, I think, will also find it beneficial. It's got quite a few notes on the text and a critical bibliography. But Harper did just a nice job with it, deckled edges, lots of illustrations in it. So I mentioned this, and it makes an excellent Christmas present. It's definitely worth taking a look at. But when this book came out with HarperCollins back in 2010, I did a number of interviews for print, radio, television, and one of the questions that I got quite a bit was how long I had been interested in the wise men, and then more generally in the study of New Testament and early Christianity more generally. Did I pick this up in undergraduate or when? Actually, I think I would pinpoint the origin to when I was actually about 8 years old, when I first got interested in this. And I grew up, for the most part, in Arizona, and spent most of my childhood in northern Arizona, Flagstaff, Arizona. Flagstaff is home to the Lowell Observatory, which is where the planet Pluto was discovered. Unfortunately, now it's been demoted from its planetary status. But I remember that one year, during the Christmas season, our United Methodist Church in town had an astronomer from the observatory come and give a presentation on whether the Star of Bethlehem might have been a real event, and if so, what it might have been. And this was the first time that I had ever seen anyone inquire about the historicity of an event found in the Bible. I had never thought about sort of looking at the Bible that way, sort of digging behind it and saying, okay, can we actually sort of verify this from outside sources? Then my family moved to the Phoenix area when I was in 5th grade, and for high school I went to a Jesuit high school. I had been involved in, say, Bible studies at Methodist churches and Presbyterian churches, but at the Jesuit high school I had to take religion courses, including a course in Scripture, which I took my sophomore year, and it was quite surprising. It was a rigorous academic approach to the Bible. It was unlike any Bible study I had previously studied, and I was absolutely hooked. And I remember asking the priest who taught the class at one point, so are there other writings, other early Christian writings that weren't included in the New Testament? And he helped me to find out more about them and pointed me toward resources that I could use to read some of these writings for myself. And then when I went to undergrad at the University of Iowa, I majored in religion and biblical studies in particular. Then, as Philip said, I went to Harvard for my master's and doctoral work. And I knew that I wanted to do something pertaining to stories about Jesus' birth. I've just, again, ever since I had been a kid, I had been fascinated with Christmas in general and the Christmas story, and particularly those writings that described sort of the birth and childhood of Jesus. And I was, at the beginning of my doctoral program, I went on a study trip to Italy, and I was struck at how much the Magi, the wise men, showed up in all sorts of art. So mosaics on church walls. This is from, I believe this is from Ravenna. And if you see up at the top there, it's got the names Balthazar, Melchior, and Caspar. And if you're really into the wise men or really into Christmas, you might know that those are the traditional names of the three wise men. But they are actually fairly late as traditions about the Magi develop. And this artistic representation, which may be, I think, 5th or 6th century, this may well be actually our earliest mention of these names for the wise men. So they were showing up on mosaics. They were showing up in paintings. Now, this, of course, doesn't look, when you first look at it, particularly impressive. It's not a sort of big ornate painting, but you can definitely tell that is Mary, and that's the child, and these are three figures offering gifts. And in fact, this is from a catacomb. So underground structure in which Jews and Christians were buried. So this is a catacomb painting of the Revelation of the Magi. And then also, They show up in many other sort of artistic representations. This is from wooden doors from the Church of Santa Sabina in Rome, and there are a number of panels on this door that depict different biblical events, and here you get the Magi showing up. And it certainly makes sense that the Magi would be so popular, given how mysterious the New Testament story about the Magi is. So the story about the Magi, as many of you probably know, is found only in one place in the New Testament. It's in the Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. It's not very long, and so it's quite worthwhile to read it here. And as we read it, this is where the first sort of audience participation comes in. I want you to think about what Matthew's story tells us about the Magi, and more importantly, what it doesn't tell us. What does it leave out that you might have thought was there? Okay. Now, when Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east, and have come to worship him." When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet, and you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who will govern my people Israel." Then Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child. And when you have found him, bring me word, that I too may come and worship him." When they had heard the king, they went on their way, and behold, the star which they had seen in the east went before them, till it came to rest over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. Then, opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. Okay, so what sorts of things do we either learn or not learn about the Magi and their star in Matthew's story? What do you see? Yes?
We never see that it's three.
We never see that it's three. Just simply says wise men from the east. It doesn't offer any sort of enumeration. Why do you think tradition held there to be three? Any guesses? Did they just pull the... Yeah, exactly. So they figured, okay, three gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. If they're offering three gifts, there must be, three individuals who would carry them. So that's, that is to some degree where that comes from. But, that's never said explicitly in the text. What else do you see or not see? Yeah.
You don't see the time frame between the birth and the time that they arrive. They see it in a house now.
Right, exactly. So, it talks about, and what we eventually will find out in sort of the next passage is that on the basis of the information that the wise men gave to Herod, Herod kills all the male children 2 and under. So it seems as if, even though Matthew never says this explicitly, it seems as if there was a sort of a gap between the star's appearance and when the Magi actually got to Bethlehem of 2 years. And so you will get in early Christian tradition a belief that the Magi, that it took them 2 years to get there. Matthew doesn't say that explicitly, but you can sort of put those pieces together. Yeah, and as you said, it's quite interesting. It's in a house. It's not in a manger. It's not in a stable like we, often think of and see in, kind of familiar nativity scenes. Here we have a house. This is one of a number of significant differences between Matthew's infancy narrative on the one hand and Luke's infancy narrative, which is the only other of the 4 canonical Gospels that has a story about Jesus' birth. What else? Yes?
We obviously don't have the time of year when they arrived, like January 6th or,
Right.
or the date, and they have come from another country, but it's not named.
Yeah. All it says, it doesn't tell us anything specific about where they're from. It just says from the east. So east of Jerusalem, someplace. And, that could be a lot of different places. And in fact, early Christians had a number of different theories for where these individuals came from in the east based on different sort of different pieces of data in the story. The earliest writer that we know of to discuss where the Magi came from in the 2nd century zeroes in on the gold, frankincense, and myrrh and says, okay, frankincense and myrrh in particular come from Arabia. And that they were kind of brought into the Roman Empire through trade routes from Arabia. But so one early Christian interpreter says they were from Arabia because that's where their gifts were from. Although obviously they could get the gifts in lots of different places. Yeah, exactly. And so you get that. You get another option of them being from Babylon or modern-day Iraq because of the idea that they are doing something with stars. And traditionally, Babylon was seen as sort of the birthplace of astrology. So if they are astrologers, which can be one of the meanings of the term Magi, they might have come from Iraq. Now, if you focus specifically on the word Magi and that name for them, on the one hand, it's actually kind of interesting that they have come into sort of English mainly as wise men, because that's a terrible translation of the word magoi in Greek. You see the word magoi, and if you don't have any sort of context around how to translate it, the best way to translate it is just magician. That's the sort of the standard default meaning. When Acts of the Apostles uses the term magos, Luke means that as magician. That's the sort of standard way, and that of course gives the story a bit of a different valence if we translate it as, behold, magicians from the east came to visit the child. So it's got that meaning, the word magoi does in antiquity, of magician or astrologer, sort of a commonplace meaning. But it can also be a technical term for a Zoroastrian priest. So a priest of this indigenous Iranian religion where you have sort of a powerful good god and then an equally powerful or almost equally powerful evil god. Zoroastrianism often thought to influence both early Judaism and early Christianity. And in fact, these hats, which actually are the ancestors of sort of medieval magicians' hats, these are what are called Phrygian caps, and they are. This is sort of a dead giveaway that this artist considers these people to be Persians, to be Iranian Zoroastrian priests, based on the way they're dressed. So that's standard sort of Persian dress. So we don't get a lot of explanation about who these people are or where they're from. And there was a lot of speculation about this in early Christianity. And in fact, as we'll see with the revelation of the Magi, the text that I've worked on, there is yet another answer, another explanation given apart from these about who these individuals were. Other things that you see or don't see? Yeah.
They evidently had knowledge of Judaism, or because they recognized and they didn't follow a star from wherever they were to Bethlehem. They evidently knew just to go straight to Bethlehem to check it out, and then the star came from Bethlehem, 6 or 7 mile journey.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so we've got a couple interesting things going on here. We've got the question of they show up and they know that a king of the Jews has been born. They've seen his star in the east. And so the question of how do they know this? What's the basis for their knowledge of this? That's never explained. How do they actually know that this star signifies the birth of the King of the Jews? And then there's the behavior of the star itself. Now, it only, as you were saying, it only, strictly speaking, says that it led them from Jerusalem to Bethlehem. That's where the star, that they saw in the east went before them. So the idea that we get, that you see dramatized of the wise men sort of following the star all the way to Jerusalem, that's not actually something that Matthew narrates. You could, I suppose, infer that from the story, but Matthew doesn't necessarily say that. So you've got sort of an unusual behavior of the star. The star, they've seen it in the east, then it goes before them and it comes to rest over the house or the place where the child was. And, is this supposed to be a natural celestial object like a star or a comet or a planet or maybe even a conjunction? Even though, every Christmas, as I did when I was 8 years old, you will get, astronomers from observatories come and talk about different theories about the Star of Bethlehem. It's hard to infer from Matthew's description that this is just a natural celestial object up there in the sky. And the earliest Christians to comment on this realized that. In particular, they realized that if you look up at a star in the sky, and you say, okay, is that star over my house or over my neighbor's house? Well, if you're looking at it and it looks like it's right over your house and you go next door, well, gee, it's going to be right over your neighbor's house too. That's just the way stars work. And so they realized that can't be it. Whatever it was something different, something special. So sometimes they said, okay, this was a special sort of star that God created for this purpose. Sometimes you get it described as an angel or the Holy Spirit. In fact, the revelation of the Magi, as we will see, has a very different and surprising interpretation of it. One last thing to mention in terms of things that aren't resolved by this story is what happened to the Magi after this? Because in terms of Matthew's gospel, these figures are in a really, really prominent place. They are the first, outside of Jesus's parents, to know that there's anything special about this individual. And yet they've come from a very long way. They've made this journey, and they recognize Jesus and they give him these gifts. And you think, gosh, what impact would that have made on them? And early Christians were sort of troubled by the fact that there wasn't any sort of explanation for what became of these folks. So actually, one early Christian writer, Tertullian, had this ingenious theory where he interpreted this last sentence allegorically. So he said, and being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. So Tertullian looks at this and says, okay, well, way can mean road, kind of a physical road that someone travels on, but it can also have a meaning of sort of a way of life or even another religion, because, say, for instance, in Acts of the Apostles, Christianity is often described as the way. And so Tertullian read this last sentence allegorically to say when they departed to their own country by another way, it's not telling us that they took a different physical route to avoid Herod, but that they went home by means of a different religion, meaning that they were now followers of Christ. Do I think that Matthew thought that, was Matthew trying to say that? I don't think so. I think Tertullian's interpretation was very clever, but I don't think this was an idea that Matthew had in mind. Okay, so there was a great deal of early Christian speculation about the wise men, the Magi. But this text that I'm going to talk about, the revelation of the Magi, is really in a class by itself. In a nutshell, it is the longest and richest story about the Magi that survives from early Christianity. And it's the only story that claims to be the Magi's personal testimony on the coming of Christ. Okay, so how did I discover this text? When I came back from my study trip to Italy, where I was blown away by all these artistic representations of the Magi, I started finding everything out about these figures that I could and what early Christians thought about them. And finally, I found a reference to the revelation of the Magi in a rather obscure article. And the article told me, among other things, that this text was only preserved in a language called Syriac. And Philip was mentioning how you've had several presentations on this. Now, it's an ancient language, sort of a Semitic language, so somewhat related to Hebrew, to Arabic. Essentially, it's a local dialect of Aramaic, and it was used by lots of Christians in the Middle East in antiquity, and it became sort of the basic language of Christians in the Middle East. In antiquity, much like Latin, sort of the status that Latin had in Europe and in the West. Now, it's a language that not many scholars know, but by a very happy coincidence, I had just finished studying my first year of Syriac at Harvard when I found out about this text. I mean, talk about winning the obscure languages lottery. It's a fascinating enough text that I probably would have gone and learned Syriac just for the purposes of working on this. But I had only chosen Syriac because a lot of my friends were doing Coptic, which is another sort of obscure language, and I said, well, I don't want to do what everybody's doing. I want to do something different. So I chose Syriac, and turned out that this great text was preserved in it. Okay, so there is one manuscript copy of the Revelation of the Magi. It's in the Vatican Library. They've had it in their possession for about 300 years. And the subtitle and sort of the blurbs that you get on the HarperCollins book, The Lost Tale of the Wise Men's Journey to Bethlehem, a forgotten ancient manuscript. That makes it sound like I sort of discovered it. I pulled it out of a cave or out of the ground or something like that. It was never lost. It was never something that was sort of hidden away. It was just in the Vatican Library's massive, massive manuscript holdings. It was cataloged where it was supposed to be. It was just something that nobody was working on. And that's certainly the case in terms of a number of apocryphal writings that just sit in sort of rare book libraries, monasteries, and they only sort of come to light, they only become known when scholars who are interested in those sorts of texts go looking for them. Okay, so the manuscript that it's contained in is what's called a world chronicle. So it's basically a history of the world from creation up through the end of the 8th century, which is when it was when the manuscript was written. Now, if it looks really difficult to read, there's a good reason for that, not just simply because it's written in Syriac. It is what's called a palimpsest. So a palimpsest is where you take a manuscript that has had something written on it already, and you scrub off the text, the previous text, as much as you possibly can and reuse it. I mean, think for instance, if you wrote something on a piece of paper, with a pencil. And then you only had that one piece of paper and you wanted to use something else. So you use the eraser and you erase all of it as well as you possibly can. But inevitably there's going to be sort of some of that undertext that stays through. So, and the reason that they did this was, this is parchment, this is vellum, so this is an animal skin. So in order to make a book of, say 200 folios, you need a number of animal skins in order to do this. It's an expensive project. And so if that's your writing medium, it makes sense that if there's a text that's not being used anymore, that you go ahead and scrub it off and you use it again. In this case, what it was fragments, parts of the Greek translation of the Old Testament, of the Hebrew Bible, what scholars refer to as the Septuagint. And in fact, it's actually an important witness to certain parts of the Septuagint. But this was, so that's in Greek. These are Syriac monks in the 8th century. They don't know Greek. They're, despite the fact that this is the Bible, this guy's like, I want to write a history of the world. I've got, I need a manuscript to do that, and I'm not going to, bother myself with this Greek translation of the Old Testament. And so, in fact, you can actually see here along the side, letters like Kappa, Omicron, Tau, things like that are, Greek letters. So that's part of the challenge in reading this manuscript. But another challenge is that the ink has become faded over time, just sort of through the passage of time. But I was fortunate enough to have the Vatican agree to, when I got these photographs taken, they also took photographs of the manuscript for me under ultraviolet light. And you can see, let's go back to that. You can see just how much clearer and brighter, really, the Syriac is. And Syriac is written from right to left, so essentially you read it that way. These high-resolution digital images of the manuscript have been exceptionally valuable. I've gone to the Vatican library to to consult the manuscript in person, but in terms of the critical edition of the text, which I'm currently producing and hope to finish next year, these photographs have been absolutely invaluable. And I can even zoom in on them to about this level. This is about as far as I can zoom in before the images start to become pixelated. But you can see, so this would be the Syriac text, and you can see the underwriting here. You can see the fragments, the Greek fragments. So it's and it's quite a long text. So why hadn't anybody done anything with this text? Why had this text never been translated into English? Well, there are a couple reasons. One is the fact that it is a non-canonical text. So, for instance, if you want a commentary on the Gospel of John, you have plenty to choose from. But even the most important apocryphal Christian writings hardly have any commentaries written on them, hardly any specialized studies. Another fact is that scholars have traditionally paid less attention to the stories of Jesus' birth than to the stories of either Jesus' death or his teachings or his miracle workings, because scholars have been interested in the question of the historical Jesus and how much of that can we recover from the gospel narratives. And the default, the sort of consensus of most scholars is that the infancy narratives, as beloved as they are, don't really have a lot of historicity behind them in terms of actually telling us about the precise circumstances of Jesus' birth. So scholars have tended to pay less attention to them. And Syriac is obscure. People often don't tend to pay attention to what happens in sort of branches of Eastern Christianity, even specialists in apocryphal literature. Okay. So, so let's go on to the revelation of the Magi itself and the plot of this story. So it starts by explaining who the Magi are and where they live. They are descendants of Adam and Eve's third son, Seth. Most people know about Cain and Abel, but not Seth. But many ancient Jews and Christians were fascinated by him and considered him to be sort of this particularly virtuous individual from whom, sort of special people descended. The Magi are said to live in a far eastern land called Shir, S-H-I-R. And based on other references that we get to Shir in other texts, this seems to have been roughly equivalent to China. So other writers will say things like Shir is the place where silk comes from, or there's a great wall there, or things like that. And so it seems to be, it's sort of a semi-mythical place, but it's roughly equivalent to what we would call China. They'd been passing down a prophecy for generations that a star would one day appear that would signal the birth of God in human form. And so then the Magi, who are the narrators of this story, describe their ritual, this ritual that they undertake every month, in some detail. They immerse themselves in a sacred spring. They ascend their country's holiest mountain. They sit in silent prayer for 3 days before entering the cave where Seth's books of Revelation are kept. And, we might think, okay, well, yeah, of course they're praying in silence because that's how people pray. That's, obviously a very common way of praying today. It's much more unusual in the ancient world. So when the text says that these Magi prayed in silence, it's calling some attention to this and saying, hey, this is different about these individuals. So that's sort of the backstory. That's who these figures are. And after setting up the backstory, the narrative then describes the moment of the star's coming. Okay, and so it's worth actually quoting that here. We cannot speak about the brilliance of the star of light, since its radiance was many times greater than the sun, and the sun could not stand out before the light of its rays. It appeared to us ourselves and the sons of our mysteries, but it did not appear to anyone else, because they were removed from its mysteries and its coming. And we saw the star enter the cave of treasures of hidden mysteries, and the cave shone beyond measure. And we entered, being afraid, and we bowed our knees at the mouth of the cave, because of the very abundance of the light. And when we rose at its command, we lifted our eyes and saw that light, which is unspeakable by the mouth of human beings. And when it had concentrated itself, it appeared to us in the bodily form of a small and humble human. And he said to us, "Peace to you, sons of my hidden mysteries." So as you might have guessed, based on the sort of what this figure says, this is the star is none other than Christ himself. So that's that is the interpretation of the revelation of the Magi for what the Star of Bethlehem is. It's not simply something that points the way to Christ. The Star of Bethlehem is actually Christ in sort of a pre-existent or celestial form. Now, in fact, we can actually look at in the Middle Ages and find some artistic representations that seem to be aware of the revelation of the Magi. Even though it's a very poorly known text today, it actually was reasonably well known in Europe in the Middle Ages. So, for instance, this is a 15th century painting in Berlin by Roger van der Weyden, a Flemish painter. And so there you see the Magi and their sacred mountain, and there is the star, but it's got a little baby in it. Similarly, in this manuscript, you have the child Jesus in the form of a star, and in fact, we know that these are actually texts that they're not just doing their own sort of imagining of Matthew's story of the Magi, but they are actually dependent on the narrative of the revelation of the Magi itself. And the reason that we know that is that apart from the Syriac text, we also have a summary of the revelation of the Magi's basic narrative in a 5th century Latin commentary on the Gospel of Matthew, known as the Opus Imperfectum in Mattheum. That means the incomplete work on Matthew, on Matthew's Gospel. So it's got a summary in it, and this commentary, this anonymous commentary on Matthew, got ascribed to John Chrysostom. John Chrysostom was a bishop of Antioch in the 4th century, fairly prominent early Christian leader. And so even though this wasn't written by Chrysostom, it got sort of lumped in with Chrysostom's other works. And as a result, the Opus Imperfectum, exists in, I think, probably about 100 manuscripts today. And that sort of guaranteed its survival. And so then in the, the 11th or the 12th century, you get this guy, Jacob of Voragine, who writes a text called the Golden Legend, which is basically a compendium of saints' lives and Christian legends and things like that. And he knows the Opus Imperfectum in Mattheum, and he sort of re-summarizes the Magi legend from the Opus Imperfectum. And once Jacob does that in the Golden Legend is an extremely popular text in medieval Europe. And once it's there, shows up in artistic representations. Thomas Aquinas talks about it. We've even got early explorers of the Americas that know this Magi legend. And so, for instance, there's an explorer in South America who, when he encounters the Incans, says, these people seem sort of Christian, they're fairly sophisticated. I wonder if these are maybe the descendants of the Magi. So, definitely some connections there. So, again, going back to the revelation of the Magi, the Magi's star is clearly Christ, although the text never actually says so. It never actually names this being as Christ. And the fact that it doesn't say so, I think, is one of the keys to understanding the worldview of this text. But I'll say more about that later. So then they follow the star to Bethlehem, but the journey is much shorter than we might expect. It's not the 2 years that we might infer from Matthew's narrative. Okay, so here's how Revelation of the Magi describes it. And the star again appeared for us, going before us and upholding our whole caravan from all sides, and enlightening us by its hidden light. And we had no need of the light of the sun or of the moon, because their light became diminished in its sight. Even our provisions were abundant in our eyes, and did not decrease, but rather from one day to another they increased when it came to rest over us with its light. And it gave rest to us from all our fatigue, as if we were not journeying on the road. And it made mountains and hills and rugged places level before us. Even the rivers before us we crossed by foot without fear, because of the light of our good guide that went along with us for our encampment. And our leader and our guide in his glory appeared to each one of us in all forms and appearances in every stage. And all the stages in which we journeyed were short and swift in our eyes, because our powerful light guided us with its victorious strength. So it doesn't specify exactly how long this journey is taking. I don't think it's 2 years. Maybe we're talking about several days here. The time references are a little vague. I like to sort of think of this star almost picking up the Magi and sort of carrying them along, almost through the air. So then they see the birth of Jesus in a cave, and rather what happens there is that the star goes into the cave, just like it did in their homeland, and transforms into a child. They meet Mary and Joseph, and then they travel back to their homeland of Shir, and they tell the people of their country about the wonderful things they've experienced. And they bring back, notice that their food that they bring on the trip, whenever the star's light shines on the food, it multiplies. And you think, oh, that's kind of an interesting detail. That's, sort of sounds a little bit like, multiplication of loaves and fishes or something like that. What happens when they go back to their country, though, is the Magi encourage their country folk to eat the food that the star had multiplied for them. The people do, and right away they start having visions of the heavenly and earthly Jesus. And it says that there was great joy throughout the land, and many people converted to faith in the being that the Magi encountered. So this seems like a logical place to end the story, but the text as we have it doesn't actually end there. Instead, the Apostle Thomas shows up, baptizes, and commissions the Magi to preach throughout the entire world. So that's how it ends, with Thomas sort of giving them an official sanction and commission. Okay, so after translating the revelation of the Magi into English, one of the first things I needed to do was figure out when it might have been written and by whom. And I had to work backwards from the only manuscript that contains the full text, which is from the 8th century. So, but this is only the latest possible date it could be written. We've got an 8th century manuscript, but the text, in fact, seems to be, perhaps as early as the 3rd century, despite the late date of the manuscript. But, and I talk in the book, I go into more detail about how I sort of arrived at a 3rd century date, and I'm happy to talk about that during the Q&A period, but I won't spend time with that right now. But one of the things that's quite important is that one of the main conclusions of my research was that the ending that has the Apostle Thomas is actually a secondary addition. Namely, it wasn't originally part of the text. And a couple different reasons for this. One is you've got a very abrupt switch from first-person narration, that is the Magi are narrating it, to third-person narration at the start of the Apostle Thomas section. And more strikingly, the Apostle Thomas section has quite different vocabulary and terminology than the rest of the story, especially related to its use of the terms Jesus and Christ. Jesus, in the first person section where the Magi narrate it, Jesus is never mentioned by name in the first person section. In the Apostle Thomas ending, which is only 4 chapters of a 32-chapter work, the name Jesus or Christ or some combination of the two shows up about 20 times. So it's all over the place in this secondary edition. Okay, so there's definitely a difference there in terms of the way that the Apostle Thomas ending is thinking about the person of Jesus versus the way the revelation of the first person section is. And I'll say a little bit more about that in just a minute. And so what I want to do is close with the 3 most interesting aspects of the text from my standpoint. First, the thing that first struck me about the revelation of the Magi was the amount of detail and thought that went into the description of the Magi, who they were, and how they knew about the star, and how they were preparing for the star. Many early Christians were puzzled by Matthew's story of the Magi, and some writers try and explain one part of it or another. But the revelation of the Magi is by far the most elaborate early Christian reflection on these figures. Second is the relationship in this text between Jesus and the Star of Bethlehem. So in Matthew, the star signifies the birth of the King of the Jews and shows the Magi exactly where he was born. And so obviously it's not a normal star, and there are lots of theories about what this was, but the revelation of the Magi does something that no other early Christian writing does in making them one and the same. And in terms of, if we were going to try and speculate about why does it do this, why does it actually say that the Jesus and the Star of Bethlehem are the same thing, there are a couple theories, but, What does Jesus say about himself in the Gospel of John? I am the light. Well, yes, he says a lot of I am stuff. That's probably, that's an imprecise question. I am the light of the world is one of the things he says. Now, most scholars think that John understood this figuratively, a light being a metaphor for salvation and knowledge. Not that, Jesus is actually luminous himself, but the revelation of the Magi seems to take this absolutely literally. And, there are also a number of early Christian writings that claim that Jesus could alter his bodily form in some way or another. This is an ability that scholars refer to as polymorphy. And there are even some hints of this in the canonical Gospels themselves. Remember, in some resurrection accounts, Jesus isn't recognized by his followers and can do things like appear in the middle of a locked room and things like that. But the revelation of the Magi is really the only text that claims that Jesus and the Star of Bethlehem were one and the same. And the last aspect is the scope of Jesus' revelation to humanity. Okay, so keep in mind that the Magi have their first contact with Jesus before he's born. Jesus, according to this text, has the ability to appear to people outside the normal boundaries of his life. Now, the New Testament, particularly John and the Gospel of John and the Apostle Paul, already talk about this, but the revelation of the Magi really picks it up and runs with it. What's most interesting is what these abilities of Jesus mean for the understanding of non-Christian religions. So if we look at what early Christians said about the gods of other people, most of them said one of two things. One, that they just didn't exist at all, that they were the products of human imagination. Or two, if they say, yeah, your gods exist, but they're actually not benevolent gods. They're demons. They're harmful demons. But there are a number of statements made throughout the text by the Magi and Jesus himself that claim that he's actually the source of many or all of humanity's religious traditions. And I'll give you one of the most striking examples of this. When Christ first appears to the Magi in the land of Shir, they're of course overjoyed that their long-awaited prophecy has come true. But to their surprise, Christ states that their experience is but one small part of his revelation to humanity. And there's this verse from chapter 13 of the Revelation of the Magi that I think is probably the most important passage in the entire text. And here's what it says. And I am everywhere, because I am a ray of light whose light has shone in this world from the majesty of my Father, who has sent me to fulfill everything that was spoken about me in the entire world and in every land by unspeakable mysteries, and to accomplish the commandment of my glorious Father, who by the prophets preached about me to the contentious house. In the same way as for you, as befits your faith, it was revealed to you about me. So you get this idea of Jesus, the revelations about Jesus showing up in every part of the world, and Jesus appearing to people as they can sort of receive him. Now remember what I said about the earliest form of the text, that it didn't have this Apostle Thomas ending. So the earliest form of the text, the first person form, never names the Magi's guide and savior as Jesus. And of course, that poses an interesting theological question. If somebody has an experience of Christ, but doesn't know that's who it is, does that make them a Christian or not? And the earliest form of the revelation of the Magi said, yes, absolutely. But somebody seems to have come along and read it and said, no, how can they be fully Christian if they don't know Jesus by name and they don't belong to the larger church? And I think that's why the Apostle Thomas ending was added. For the person who added this, it was insufficient for them to experience Christ if they didn't then become connected to the worldwide Christian community. So in fact, in this text, in its original form and in its secondary ending, we have two quite different visions of what it means for someone to be a Christian. And these two visions are still being advanced today by religious leaders and theologians. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We have a lot of time for questions. I'm just going to make one remark while I can, which is the idea of the Cave of Treasures is the name of a famous work in Syriac Apocryphal world, but the idea of the Cave of Treasures just shows up in so many different, I don't know if it's like hundreds of different works,
right.
But it's a whole mythology that unites the sequence of prophets and revelation from the Garden of Eden right up until the crucifixion. It's such a powerful idea.
Right, exactly. So Cave of Treasures is basically, and that's what the cave that the Magi's sacred writings are housed in. We see a cave of treasures in lots of different writings, and sometimes it's the burial place of Adam and Eve, or it's a place for, the gifts that the Magi are eventually going to bring. There's sort of different descriptions of it. But yeah, it's really interesting that in this text, the Magi's revelation, Seth is the one who writes it down, but Adam is the one who transmits it to Seth. And the belief is that because Adam ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, he actually now has knowledge of the future. He has prophetic knowledge, and he's able to talk about what's going to happen at the end of time. And so he tells Seth about the star that's eventually going to appear. And part of the reason that he knows about this star is that the star was in the Garden of Eden before the fall, and it's actually hovering over the tree of life. And when Adam and Eve eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, the star disappears. But Adam, thanks to the knowledge he has received, knows that the star will return someday.
One of the most important things the Cave of Treasures literature does is absolutely eliminate differences between the Old and the New Testament. I could ask many questions. I will shut up. Any questions?
Yes.
Any comments, please?
Yes?
So who do you think wrote this?
Yeah, well, so...
we know that.
On the one hand, this text presents itself as the first-person testimony of the Magi themselves. Do I think that it's actually the real Magi, if there were real individuals? Do I think it was written by the real Magi? No, I don't think it was. Mainly because, for a couple different reasons. One is that texts that are pseudepigraphic, that is, who have an author ascribed to them who's not actually the person who wrote it, pseudepigraphic texts are very, very common in early Judaism and Christianity. So we've got revelations to people like Enoch, or attributed to Enoch, Abraham, Adam, Moses, the Apostle Peter, the Apostle Paul, Mary Magdalene, goes on and on. So we know that that's very, very common. And, if we see a text that says, I'm by the, Magi, or I'm by, whoever, Pontius Pilate or somebody like that, we're just generally a little bit skeptical to begin with. But if it were really written by the Magi themselves, the problem with that is that it seems to know writings in the New Testament that weren't written until, long after the historical Magi would have died. So, like, for instance, the Gospel of John is very, very prominent in this text. And the language that Jesus uses, like, about, Father and Son, is taken from John's Gospel, but John is usually thought to have been written around the year 100. So the text has to be later than those writings to which it's referring. So essentially what I think in terms of who wrote it, we can't ever know sort of definitively who did, but the fact that it seems to have originally been written in Syriac is an interesting point, because the Syriac church sort of spans Turkey, Iran, Iraq. It's sort of the gateway to Asia. And because of this position, I think that Syriac Christians were actually in a sort of a better position to think about religious diversity than what most people say in the Greco-Roman world did, where, there's a lot of different gods in the Greco-Roman world, but they're all sort of following the same patterns and things like that. Compare that with Syrian Christians who, through, trade routes and things like that, would have been exposed to Buddhists, Hindus, Zoroastrians, maybe even Taoists, Confucians. They would have had sort of a glimpse of just, the astonishing religious diversity that was out there in a way that people in sort of the interior of the Roman Empire wouldn't necessarily have had, being on the frontier as they were. So I don't think I can say, definitively who wrote it, but I think it's quite interesting that it came out of a region where there was actually a lot more contact with religions that were very different from Judaism and Christianity. Good question, thank you. Yes?
Brent, in addition to the Gospel of John, do we know other New Testament documents that this writer has access to, that he's reflecting on? So, for example, in the passage that you read about the star following the wise men, that doesn't sound horribly unlike the rock that followed them in the desert. Could you reflect a little bit on that for us who've yet to read the document? Yeah, so the passage that you were mentioning, the 1 Corinthians 10:4, Paul talks about the Israelites drinking from a rock, and of course that's a reference to the wilderness narratives. But Paul makes this interesting comment and says, "And the rock was Christ." And with so much of what we see in Paul's letters, we really wish he'd tell us more. Because it's just so hard to figure out. Like, is he making an analogy? Is he actually saying that Christ was in a pre-existent form and appeared to the Israelites and gave them water in the form of a rock? It's hard to say, but that's certainly one of the passages that when I'm thinking about not simply the fact that Christ can appear in multiple forms, which this text shares with a number of other early Christian writings, but the fact that he can appear in non-human form, that's much more unusual. And that passage from 1 Corinthians is definitely one of the few that we could point to this way and say, okay, there is that idea there. Whether or not, I think the revelation of the Magi certainly knows the 1 Corinthians passage. I'm not sure that he is necessarily basing his view explicitly on this, but his knowledge of Scripture, both New Testament writings and Hebrew Bible is completely, very, very extensive. So there are echoes of Scripture all over the place. But in terms of sort of getting back behind this image of Christ as a star, which I'm very interested in, I would agree with you that that 1 Corinthians passage is one of the places that we could say, okay, there's a comparandum here. Yeah, good question. Yeah.
You have the light at the road to Damascus also, right? The Lord speaks in that.
Right.
Even closer.
Sure. Yeah.
Can you go back to the art?
Yeah.
Question about
This one? Or earlier?
No, I think this is the one that has the Christ child is for life, these two.
Right, exactly.
So I guess my question is, if this is, as you say, the Golden Legend is the inspiration of a lot of medieval and Renaissance art. But in the Golden Legend, I guess I'm wondering, so we're seeing the revelation of the Magi refracted through the Golden Legend.
Right.
So we end up with 3 and not multiple Magi, not
Right.
however many there are, 12, whatever.
Right.
But in the Golden Legend, isn't there a cross that speaks to the Magi?
I'm trying
I'm
to.
certain that it sounds like the Gospel of Peter, but I think there's the child, there's the light in the form of a child, and then a cross beneath.
Yeah,
Speech that gives them directions.
Well, and in fact, that reference to there being sort of a child in the star and also the sign of the cross, that actually goes back to the Opus Imperfectum. So that's actually something that the Legenda Aurea, the Golden Legend, takes over from the Opus Imperfectum. And yeah, you don't really see it in the Roger van der Weyden picture, but you do see it here. This is, 12th century Vincent of Beauvais' Speculum Humanae Salvationis. And you do get that reference to the cross there. So that's actually one of the things that, if you compare the Opus Imperfectum's version of this story, which is a summary, it's only a couple, about a paragraph long. If you compare that with the Syriac text, there's one reference in the Syriac text that makes it sound like maybe there's a sign of a cross connected with the star, but it's just a passing reference. But
I guess I'm wondering
yeah.
if there might be multiple versions of the story, and this happens to be the one that's extant to it. That is, that there could have been
Yeah.
other versions.
Yeah.
Necessarily a direct line from this to the.
Yeah, definitely. Well, and one of the things that we need to keep in mind is the whole question of what did the original text of the Opus Imperfectum's legend of this look like? And we've got 100 manuscripts of the Opus Imperfectum, but there's been no critical edition that's ever been done of it. The only, so that if you want to cite the Latin text, if you want to look at the Latin text of the Opus Imperfectum, you have to use Minya's Patrologia Graecae, and even though this is in Latin, it's in the Patrologia Graecae because it's considered in one of Chrysostom's works. But Minya is, if you do anything with Minya's stuff, you know how unreliable Minya's editions can be. So one of the things that I'm needing to do, and will probably be spending some time over my Christmas break doing, is collecting as many manuscripts as I can, as many images from manuscripts of the Opus Imperfectum, so that I can actually collate what their forms of the legend. And in terms of how many different variants there were of the revelation of the Magi in its complete form, we've got this 8th century Syriac text. We don't know how much would have been added or interpolated. It doesn't seem like the scribe who copied it into the 8th century World Chronicle, he seems to have not been somebody who added and played around with his sources a whole lot, but that's a pretty big gap between 3rd century and 5th century, or 8th century. And the fact that we've also got the reference to it in this Latin commentary, the author of the Latin commentary had access to the libraries at Constantinople. So probably what that means is that in the 5th century, there was a Greek version of the revelation of the Magi floating around. But this is one of the tricky things where, on the one hand, if there were a Greek version of this text discovered tomorrow, I'd be very, very excited. It would make my sort of text critical and critical edition stuff much, much more challenging. But we've got one witness to this text, and that's often the way it is, unfortunately, with apocryphal texts, where you have to sort of rely on one and oftentimes relatively late manuscripts for texts that may have been written much earlier than that.
Are you confident that Syriac was the original language of composition?
I'm open to different possibilities. One of the things that you do get is a couple things that point toward this. One is that you've got plays on words in the text that only make sense in Syriac, and it's not impossible that somebody could have added, interpolated those passages in, but that makes sense. And secondly, even though the Apostle Thomas ending isn't, I don't think it's an original part of the text, the Apostle Thomas is a very, very prominent individual in Syriac-speaking Christianity. So if you've got an Apostle Thomas sort of secondary ending that gets added on, that's certainly happening in a Syriac milieu. That makes it much more likely that the earlier form of the text would have also been in a similar milieu. But good question, yeah. Yeah?
So you said it was an area called Shir, which could be China.
Mm-hmm.
China's history dates pretty far back. Would it be more difficult to find references to this text through Chinese
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And on the one hand, we certainly know the Syriac church and sort of Syriac Christian missionaries did actually get in the ancient world as far as China. And there are a number of Central Asian languages that Syriac Christian works were translated into. So there's always the possibility, say with the discoveries at Turfan or something like that, that we could find, references to the revelation of the Magi. I just learned at the SBL about a Uyghur version of a story about the Magi that doesn't seem to be the same text as this. My guess is that the author of the revelation of the Magi, even though he's, locating the Magi in Shir, and he seems to, because he describes this as being at the far eastern part of the inhabited world and at the shore of the great ocean, so he has some idea of that geography. I don't think he's ever been there before. I don't think he knows anything about the place. What he's essentially doing by putting the Magi there, I think, is there was a belief in the ancient world that at the edges of the inhabited world you had sort of super races, superhuman, almost almost just human beings and cultures that were far more sophisticated than anything that you would get just sort of in the center of the world. And so we can look and see, in Greek texts where they say, okay, up at the North Pole live the Hyperboreans, and they are, these people who have all these, special characteristics. And in fact, in several different texts that do talk about people from Shir, it says things like they have no warfare, they don't get sick, they live to extremely long ages. So I think the author is not placing these people in Shir because he's ever actually been to China and that he knows anything firsthand about it. He's just sort of tapping into sort of pre-existing ideas about what people at the far ends of the earth would have been like. Not really. I mean, obviously you've got, the sort of the hub of Syriac speaking Christianity is Edessa, which is now in southeastern Turkey. So that's the hub. That's where we have references to Thomas's, the bones of the Apostle Thomas and things like that. So but so it would make sense. This author is fairly sophisticated. He's thinking about this stuff at a fairly high level. It would make sense for him to live in a major center of Syriac Christian culture, and Edessa would be one option, but it wouldn't be the only option. You could have several others, but Edessa would definitely be a leading candidate. Yes.
So is the Christ light in the star maybe related to the Shekinah glory in Solomon's temple, or the light that led the Israelites in the wilderness?
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly, if you think about it sort of cross-culturally or across religions, certainly the way that many religions describe sort of divinity or, kind of exalted holiness is through light. It just, it's just sort of a standard metaphor that you see in lots of different places. So on a very basic level, if you're asking the question of, okay, well, why does this text present Jesus as a star, as a form of light? There's just lots of light imagery in religions, kind of throughout the world, but certainly you've got connections in Jewish and Christian literature, like you said, the idea of the Shekinah, and that those may be some sort of later ideas that come in, but that's that's definitely all part of the same thought world, I would say. Yeah. Yes?
I was going to ask, do you know what it was written over?
Yes, so it's fragments of the Septuagint, so fragments of the Greek Old Testament. So it's some of Joshua, Judges, that part, basically. So there's a separate edition of those fragments because they happen to be, an important witness to the Greek text of those writings. But for, the 8th century Syriac writer, he doesn't know Greek at all. And for him, it doesn't matter if this is, the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament or just, somebody's grocery list in Greek. Like, it's not of any use to him regardless of what it is. So, it's interesting to think about the idea that somebody has a copy of the Bible and just, decides to erase it and write, a different work over it. Yeah.
Is there in that revelation of the Magi or whatever it's called, do they treat the encounter with Herod and that whole part of the story as Matthew?
A little bit. One of the weird things about this story is that, it's obviously Matthew's story about the Magi that's the sort of the chief inspiration for this. And, because if Matthew didn't tell this story about the Magi, there wouldn't be a revelation of the Magi. But it's interesting that, in terms of Matthew's story about the Magi and the sort of stopover in Jerusalem, it's almost like the revelation of the Magi sort of goes through the motions there and has the Magi meet with Herod, but doesn't spend a lot of time on that, and essentially the Magi sort of come away and say, oh, he's just really dumb, and just kind of go on their way, and the star leads them. Similarly with the gifts, there's obviously lots of speculation in early Christianity about the significance of gold, frankincense, and myrrh, and one of the popular interpretations that emerges is that these are symbols of Christ's different sort of roles or different identities. So gold for a king, frankincense for a god, and myrrh either symbolizing death or symbolizing healing power. So you get interpretations like that, but the revelation of the Magi never says anything about the gifts. I mean, it just mentions the gifts, but it doesn't say it's gold, frankincense, and myrrh. It's not particularly interested in them. So it's taking Matthew's story obviously as its jumping off point, but it doesn't feel particularly beholden to that narrative.
Okay, so you noted that Greek didn't seem to be of any particular utility in this 8th century scribe's world, which I'd be fine hearing more about that, because that can't be all that long after the Arab conquest of what used to be the Roman East.
Right.
But perhaps more importantly, then what was the utility of making a world chronicle of a particular character at this time, again, not long after the Islamic conquest? And are there traces in the text that say has particular, thrust or cut to them, saying, hey, Christianity is really worldwide, it's gone everywhere, it's gone even to Shir, and it's derived everything from them? Or what's the political utility of doing this text?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a great question in terms of why does somebody write sort of a history of the world in the 8th century? There are earlier examples of this in Syriac literature. For whatever reason, and it's not just Syriac, I mean, we have examples from Greek, but we have several examples of world chronicles written in Syriac. So the idea of sort of writing an account of the history of the world seems to have been something that appealed to a certain segment of Syriac writers. And it's... in terms of why this author is citing this, basically he's got a bunch of sources in front of him. He seems to have, based on people who have sort of researched the chronicle itself, he seems to have been in this position where he could travel around from this monastery and kind of consult other monasteries' libraries and things like that. So he seems to have been a little bit mobile, and he just sort of puts in whatever stuff he's got. So if it gets to the point where, he's talking about Alexander the Great. He says, oh, well, I've got this legend about Alexander, so he just drops that into the text. When he gets to the Magi, he says, oh, yeah, I've got the story about the Magi. I'm just going to drop this in. So part of it is just, I guess the sort of same thing that compels somebody to write a reference book or a, encyclopedia or something like that.
Even those are very politically charged when they first came out.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and the thing is, one of the interesting things is in terms of the early history of Islam, this is an important source. The Syriac Christian authors are essentially on the front lines in terms of when, at the very beginnings of Islam. And so this source talks a lot about sort of that and about the relations and the status of Christians under Islamic rule. And just one thing that's interesting, most of the time we often have, when you deal with ancient manuscripts, you're dealing with something that's a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy. One scholar that's actually worked on this quite a bit actually thinks that this is the autograph of this chronicle, and that this may well have even been the only form that the only manuscript of the chronicle that ever existed. And the reason that he argues this is that there are little marginal notes that almost seem to be like reminders to the guy to say, okay, make sure I talk about this, make sure I talk about that. So there are some features that have suggested that actually what we've got here is, this was somebody's, I don't know, vanity project sounds bad, but it was just sort of somebody's labor of love that, when they weren't, washing the dishes in the monastery or whatever, they were writing a history of the world. Yes?
Is it complete except for that fragment missing at the top?
Yeah, with the exception of a few little pieces here and there where we've lost, say, 3 or 4 words, yeah, it's basically complete. We've pretty much got the whole text, and yeah, there are just a few small lacunae.
On the first slide, the artwork, it had like initials before each of the 3 names, like SCS or something.
Yeah, that stands for Sanctus, so saint.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So that's what those are. Oh, and I missed my last slide, which was product placement.
Are there any other questions? Well, look, if not, I want to say thank you very much for a great presentation. For what it's worth, there's an exact contemporary off in Britain of somebody called Nennius who puts together a chronicle at this exact time. And in his introduction he says, I'm not a learned man, I've just made a heap of what I found. And that sounds like he's being modest, but scholars through the centuries have said, yes, you're right. It is just a shapeless heap.
Yep, exactly.
What we've got. Thank you very much for a great presentation.
Thank you.